and this sound is in the range of about 500 to 1,000 hertz. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the swish, swish sound, which has been measured, is really not low-frequency noise, nor is it infrasound. I think it's important to look at this table to gain some perspective because, as I said, concerns have been raised that maybe it's not the loudness of the sound, but maybe it's the frequency of the sound that we have to be aware of. This is from standard acoustical texts that indicate, as you can see on the top column, the frequency in hertz, which is cycles per second. And as you can see on the right-hand column, extremely to the right, that's 20 hertz. The sound level would have to be at about 79 decibels in order for a 20 frequency hertz sound to be heard. Similarly, as you go all the way to the left, as you can see, as you go lower and lower in frequency, the sound level has to be higher and higher in order to be recognized. Now, as I said, the noise level refers to the loudness of the sound necessary for it to be heard at the respective frequency. And with wind turbines, the infrasound is emitted from wind turbines, and it has been measured in certain cases, is usually at the level of about 50 to 70 decibels, sometimes higher, but almost uniformly, certainly in all the reports that I've seen, the infrasound that's been detected in the vicinity of wind turbines has been inaudible. Now, are there health effects? Again, concerns have been raised about long wavelengths with low frequency sound. Some of the acoustics associated with the sound associated with wind turbines may be complicated, but just think as the frequency gets lower and lower, you generate vibrations. Now, low frequency sound can be traveling. It can travel through walls, it can travel through buildings and so forth, in contrast to high frequency sound, which is usually abated by various obstructions like walls and so forth. There doesn't appear, at least based on the review, and again, our review is not independent research, but looking at articles that have been published, no evidence as far as we were able to find of physiological effects from infrasound or low frequency sound at the levels generated by wind turbines. There can, however, be effects from the sounds if they become audible, but these are similar to the effects from any other audible sounds. For example, the unfortunate military that have to worry about intermittent explosive devices and so forth, those things, when they go off, generate considerably high noise levels. And there are examples of people suffering from ruptured tympanic membranes, that's ruptured eardrums and so forth. So high noise levels acutely can be very damaging, as well as chronically if the levels are high enough. Now, what I tried to do, and what certainly I tried to do to really understand potential health implications of wind turbines, is look at two major areas. One, I wanted to see if whether or not there were any studies of people living in the proximity of wind turbines that were published in the peer-reviewed literature. And then where there weren't studies, to try to look at mechanisms that may have been evaluated in experimental studies. For example, concerns about infrasound or concerns about low frequency sound. Sometimes in laboratories, people participate in investigative studies where these exposures are assessed. So with respect to studies of people in the vicinity of wind turbines, there were three major reports that were published in the peer-reviewed literature. One most recently was released in August 2009, and this was a sample of just under about 2,000 people who were randomly selected among 70,000 adults who lived within about 2.5 kilometers, that's approximately 1.5 miles, of a wind turbine in Netherlands. Every one of the wind turbines in the Netherlands was assessed. There were about 2,000 of them. In addition to people completing a questionnaire, there are actually sound level measurements available based on calculations. And again, in any environmental epidemiology study, you're looking at some link, if there is a link, between an exposure, whatever that exposure may be, and B, some designated health effect. So here you have sound level measurements, and you have people completing a questionnaire. These are what Peterson and his colleagues reported. You can see on the left-hand column, that's the sound level that was calculated between 30 and 35 decibels, the number of people in the various groups there at those noise levels, and then how many people reported being very annoyed at these sound levels. And as you can see, as the noise levels increase from 30 to 35 on upward, more and more people tend to be annoyed by the sound, or very annoyed by the sound. In fact, at about 40 to 45 decibels, upwards of about 11% of those who completed the questionnaire reported being very annoyed. And the authors noted that the percentage of people who reported annoyance from wind turbine sound appeared to lie somewhere between aircraft noise from an airport and shunning yards, which are railroad yards. And the correlation was also noted, as in other studies, of a link between a person's attitude towards the wind turbines and whether they reported annoyance from the wind turbines. And I'll describe this in a little more detail. Similarly, the same investigators, these are Swedish investigators. As many of you may know, wind turbines are fairly common in Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and so forth. But this was a study of about 754 people in Sweden. They used a similar approach with people being mailed a questionnaire, again, randomly selected. As you can see, there were 754 of approximately 3,500 people who were eligible, but they were randomly selected to participate. Once again, sound measurements were calculated, and the people lived anywhere from about 605 to over 1,000 meters from the wind turbines. What they found were results very similar to the Dutch study, and that is as the noise levels increased, more and more people tended to be annoyed by the noise. As you can see, greater than about 40 decibels, about 15% of the people surveyed were very annoyed. Interestingly enough, the investigators also tried to tease out why some people would be annoyed and others weren't, because they weren't able to directly link a lot of the annoyance with the sound levels. And they found an odds ratio. An odds ratio is a fancy way of saying the ratio between the study group and the control group. But they found an odds ratio of about 13.4. These are statistically significant results based on an attitude towards wind turbines, whether it was visual impact or just a person's attitude. Those who didn't like wind turbines were about 13 times more likely to be annoyed by the sound from the wind turbines. There was also a study by the same authors in Sweden where they looked at about 350 people in 5 domestic areas. The wind turbines were about 600 to 660 kilowatts. And they also did a frequency analysis. One of the concerns that's been raised, at least I've heard, is there's not enough research that's been done or enough data that have been collected, but frankly there is a fair amount of information out there. It may not be as complete as perhaps we'd all prefer, but there is a fair amount of information available. And in this particular study, the authors looked at a frequency analysis. That is, they looked at the so-called low-frequency sound, that is less than 200 hertz. And the sound levels ranged from the mid-30s to the mid-40s, aside from the spike of about 48 decibels at 26 hertz. And the distances from the homes to the wind turbines in the study ranged from about 150 to 1,200 meters. And among 132 people in the relatively low noise levels, 32 to 35, at a distance of 500 to 599 meters, about 6% reported being very annoyed. And once again, similar results occurred where people's attitudes toward wind turbines was a strong factor associated with annoyance. Now, these results are very similar, and based on the similarity of the results of these studies in the vicinity of wind turbines in Sweden and the Netherlands, a number of conclusions can be drawn. A small percentage of people report being very annoyed by the sound from wind turbines at levels less than 35 decibels. As the levels increase, more and more people report being annoyed. And the perception of annoyance from the sound of wind turbine seems to be strongly related to the attitudes towards wind turbines, with people who are most likely to be annoyed are those who don't like the wind turbine for some reason or another. Now let's take a look at infrasound and low frequency noise. The reason that we wanted to look at this particular aspect of wind turbines is concern has been raised that maybe the sound isn't very high, but the type of sound that may be generated by wind turbines may be something we should be aware of. In summary, that we weren't able to find any link between low frequency noise from wind turbines and health effects. And by comparison purposes, for any of you who have had any experience in getting pharmaceuticals through the Food and Drug Administration, you know the arduous 10-year process minimum it takes to get something approved. And the FDA, you should know, approves infrasound for therapeutic massages at about 70 decibels. Let's take a look at some studies. These are reports that have been done primarily in Denmark, the United Kingdom, and the United States, where efforts were undertaken to look at noise levels in the vicinity of wind turbines and also look at frequency distribution of the sound wherever possible. This Danish study was just released about 2 years ago, and these results are not, conclusions are not necessarily of mine, but from the authors themselves. The wind turbines do not emit audible infrasound, and other noise sources such as road traffic emit low frequencies of higher levels. And there's an approximate 5 to 15 decibel attenuation, basically a reduction of the noise, when you go from outdoors to indoors with the windows shut. And again, the percentage of people annoyed by wind turbine noise, at least in this study, less than 40 decibels, was about 5%. The British also did a study where they looked at wind turbines in Cornwall, and they found that low-frequency noise associated with road traffic was greater than the sound from neighboring wind farms, and that the infrasound associated with modern wind turbines will not be injurious to the health of a wind farm neighbor. And the measurements of infrasound of a modern wind farm at distances of 200 meters or between 25 and 40 decibels, which are, as you know, below perception thresholds. Essentially, people can't hear it.